I drive a lot for work, and I get to see a lot of Pennsylvania. Sometimes I take my break time to explore the areas I'm in, go to small town museums and thrift shops. I also fly fish, but not often on lunch breaks, excepting maybe 2 occasions. Regardless, one of my favorite towns in Pennsylvania is near dead center, in Centre County, and it's called Center Hall. There are some fantastic road names in the area of Center Hall, which is near the Bald Eagle Forest and Penn's Cave. There's Blue Ball, that's a great name, and then there's another road named Swamped Church, which I came upon while looking for Penn's Creek for possible fishing purposes. Knowing that roads lead to places, I followed Swamp Church Road to its logical conclusion, that being a church. However, I would follow Swamp Church down other roads not marked on the map, and it seems that a lot of people I spoke to in Center and Mifflin counties had a story about the church. If you're driving on Route 80, get off at the junction with 99 and head south toward Bellefonte. You'll merge onto 64/26 and head south towards Pleasant Gap. Here, you'll get on 144 heading east, and it winds up and through some hilly land acneed with ferns and springs, and you get to the bottom of what feels like a narrow mountain pass of old world alpine variety, and there you are in Center Hall with the main street in front of you. This has next to nothing to do with the story at hand, but it's one of my favorite moving scenes, and I recommend you drive it if you're lucky enough to be in the area sometime. In autumn and winter, it's stupendous, and I imagine it's how people feel when you take them through Pittsburgh by way of the Liberty Tubes, where you see nothing until bam, and there's the Pittsburgh skyline. I remember coming into Pittsburgh this way when we first moved out to western Pennsylvania when I was a kid, and I was surprised to see the city was as clean as it was based on everything I heard about Pittsburgh. So yeah, that had really nothing to do with the story at hand, but bear with me. So anyhow, I'm only 15 minutes or so from having enjoyed this view, and I was on the hunt for a lead-in for Penn's Creek, which I'd heard about from another banjo player in the town of Center Hall. Anyhow, I was out by Penn's Cave, which is the only water cavern in the Commonwealth, when I see a road marked Swamp Church, and I figure I have to follow that sign. The story of Swamp Church goes back to the mid-19th century when the Bethesda Evangelical Church was completed. The land upon which it sat is rather moist, which is kind of indicative not only by the name, which it's more commonly known by today, that being Swamp Church, but also is the result of the soil upon which it sits as well as its proximity to Penn's Creek. The church would be completed around 1855, but would never reach a large congregation, being as it was a small farming area known as Farmer's Mill. They had a mill nearby. It was also a couple years late to the game, as the Lutherans had a church by the late 18th century and merged with another congregation, building a new church in 1853. It also still stands today, maybe 2,000 feet from Bethesda Evangelical Church. Unlike Bethesda Evangelical Church, it still has a congregation and regular services, but I'll get to that. Around 1865, Bethesda Evangelical Church got a bell, which was the fashion for churches at the time. Despite some other developments which gave the church good reason to rally, including not just the bell but a chandelier bought in by some prominent members, the decades before the turn of the century were particularly lean years for the congregation, which again was never particularly large to begin with. First, several families left Pennsylvania in the 1880s for the frontier, where they felt they were being called as missionaries. Several of these families went to Jewel City in Kansas, and histories of the church note they built in that town not only stands to this day, but was built to resemble the one they had left behind in Centre County. In 1891, there would be a division in the church itself. There was a schism of sorts among the Evangelical Association, which was kind of the umbrella of which the church belonged to. I can't speak much to these sectarian arguments, as I'm neither a member of the church nor well versed enough in its practices to be able to distinguish it much from other forms of Christianity. Regardless, these two factions would make up some 30 years later in 1922 and be reunited into one body again. Despite these reconciliations, membership at Bethesda Evangelical Church continued to decline. By 1961, the church's enrollment had dwindled to half a dozen people. Services at the church ended the same year, and the congregation merged with another in the town of Spring Mills, which is 2 or 3 miles to the east. The current owners purchased the church in 1964, and so far as I or the internet knows, they continue to own the church. They consider it an emotional and moral obligation to keep it up and maintain it as best they can, even in the face of their aging years. The owners were married in the church in the mid-50s. So why the name Swamp Church? Talking to people in the area, they say it was due to the fact that the ground the church stood on often so soggy in the fact that they could not bury past members of the congregation on the hallowed grounds of the church. There are tales of wraith-like mists that give the grounds at dusk an eerie look and swirl around the church over the legs of a person walking through the area, and that kind of lends the atmosphere of the place. This is how most people begin their version of the story, and I mean the story, because as I said, when I opened this up, I heard a lot about the place, and everybody has a story, but it was all more or less the same story, all variations on one another, but all the characters and events remaining consistent. The church's current owners even acknowledge the story, and it goes something like this. There was a couple named Schultzes, who in the 1880s lived within sight of the church, across the road in fact. They claimed that on one starless May evening, they were sitting on their porch enjoying the warm spring breezes when the temperature became preternaturally chilly. On the road walking toward the church was a black shadowy figure of a woman. The sight of the figure greatly disturbed them, but they were just too frightened to move, and they didn't even really understand why it upset them so much at the time. They sat on their porch and they watched as this figure of a woman walked into the church, and visible still through the church windows by way of a candlelight that appeared. She walked throughout the church, and after some time, the figure walked out and back down the road to where it had come from. The Schultzes continued to sit frozen on their porch for some time after the figure had passed. The story goes on to speculate that the mournful figure in black is that of a young mother who has been shunned by the congregation following the birth of her child. She, an unwed mother, had lost her lover in the Civil War Battle of Chancellorsville. Some say that she goes to the church and is pleading with the members, or that she is showing the baby that she had birthed in his absence to the members of the church. The story is fairly well known in central Pennsylvania area, and I've read an account of it in one of Jeffrey Frazier's books. If you're not familiar with Frazier's Pennsylvania Fireside Tales and other books, I really can't recommend them enough. As you would expect, stories such as this gather a lot of people snooping it about in the hopes of coming into contact with something that will constitute evidence of life hereafter, even if we find it terrifying to look at. Or, other people who are looking to be scared or to prove that they're not scared or incapable of being scared, or perhaps they've just run out of better ideas of things to do in general. Regardless, at night, people are known to drive past the church slowly, often during the spring nights of May, and typically with their windows down. And why with their windows down? Because, supposedly, as the story has evolved, the woman is calling out the name Will, and some say on certain nights you can hear that cry of that name coming through. And, if you have your windows up in your car, you might not. But considering the current owner's affinity for and pride in the old Bethesda Evangelical Church, also known as Swamp Church, I can't imagine that the traffic much pleases them.